guys, so welcome to my home gym. If you're new to the channel, my name's John. I'm the owner of Strength Forge, and my goal is to deliver strength to those who need it. Main focus of this series that I'm going to start putting out is a training log to give people an insight into what goes on behind the scenes with regard to my training. I think ultimately at the minute within the fitness industry, particularly within the sports like strongman, powerlifting and so on, there's a bit of a divide in terms of who you actually, or what you get to see. You get to see the elites, you get to see some people that are absolute beginners like tutorials and so on, but there's not necessarily that middle ground showing people on the road to trying to get as strong as possible. Now you'll see on the channel that I put out other content talking about the science behind training and so on. With this series, I'm going to be breaking down what exercises I do and why I do them, but I'm going to keep it relatively brief and a bit more casual. If you've got any questions about any of the rationale behind certain things, then please just leave them in the comments below. But ultimately, I'm just going to show you what goes on behind the scenes. Now, today's session I thought I'd start off on a good one. I'm going for a huge deadlift PB, a lifetime PB of 255 kilos for 5 reps. My goal towards the end of this year, or rather before the end of the year, is to pull 300 kilos at a body weight of about 100, so triple body weight deadlift. In terms of my other lifts, I'm increasing whatever I need to increase that will ultimately contribute towards my deadlift, but I'm putting everything else on the back burner at the moment, so I'm not looking at increasing my squats significantly, other than trying to increase volume and speed strength within that movement so that it carries over to the deadlift. And other than that, the sole focus is that 300 kilo deadlift. So I'll show you each phase of the training session, but let's get right into it. Okay guys, so just a bit of a brief demonstration of a couple of the warm-up exercises that I tend to do. Now, in terms of a warm-up, I get asked this question a lot. How many exercises should you do? Should you be stretching? All these different kind of aspects of it. The way I break warm-ups down tend to be pulse raiser first, hence why I'm a little bit out of breath, okay? You have mobility, ideally dynamic, based off certain mobilization patterns, as you saw with me doing the mountain climber stretch and that type of thing, just to loosen off the muscles that are going to be worked within the certain exercises, as well as the muscles that will be tight from whatever you've been doing prior to the movement or the lift that you're going to be doing that day. So just keep that in mind, that you can have standardized warm-ups, but it's the one area where I always encourage people to start taking a little bit of initiative, because ultimately the person that you're working with, whether it's your coach or whether you run your program yourself, the thing that varies might be the task that you were doing prior to the actual lift itself. So just check or sense check certain positions. For example, what do your hip flexors feel like at end range? Do your glutes switch on when you try and contract them? You know, can you reach your arms overhead? It's not uncommon for people to be tight in that area one day and loose in another. Then you go into things like postural correction. So you saw with me doing the hip airplane pattern, trying to work on internal rotation of my hip and so on, just because it allows that glute to fire a little bit more within the deadlift. And then ultimately just going through a drill that patterns an improvement in stability within that area. So if you're working on a low body movement, it tends to be a hip stability drill. So I'm doing a reverse lunge complex where I'm changing complexity, starting to introduce rotation, focus on driving through a triple extension. Just gets those muscles firing in a sequence similar to the deadlift, but I'm not necessarily wasting any energy within that movement. I'm a big believer, just me personally, there's no actual empirical evidence to suggest it, but I'm a big believer on conserving energy when you're working up to a PB, not wasting energy within the warm-ups. Other strength coaches will disagree, that's absolutely fine, but whenever I know and it's planned in to say that I'm going for a PB, I will do, as you'll see when I'm warming up with the bar, I'll do a set of 5 with 60 kilos, triple with 100, and then it's just singles from there on, right the way up to my top set. So that's just my personal preference. Obviously it depends on what phase of training you're in, but let's get the deadlift set up and let's dive in. Okay, so we've got the deadlift set up. Now, as I touched on briefly a moment ago, when it comes to warming up for a PB based session, I'll take a very minimalist approach. You'll see me doing a couple of exercises in between deadlift sets, just based off how the movement feels on that particular day. Times when I feel explosive, so I don't need to do any potentiation exercises necessarily. Times if I'm feeling a bit slow, I might throw in a couple of plyometric based exercises like counter movement jumps, or some you'll see as we go through, just a bit more explosive movement just to get the fast twitch fibers going and get those higher threshold motor units recruited. Now, when it comes to specific deadlift technique, I've covered this in a separate video or lecture on the deep dive into the deadlift, so the science behind the movement. If you want a specific tutorial breaking it down, that's absolutely fine, I can do that. But ultimately, you've got to remember the 4 laws of training: consistency, specificity, individuality, and progression. Individuality is a huge factor to take into account. Me personally, the way I'm built, okay, and the level of training that I'm at now, I intentionally create a little bit of flexion in my thoracic spine. So I'm intentionally rounding over slightly here, shortens the range of motion, it allows me to get a little bit more speed off the floor, makes it easier at lockout. It's that simple. I don't necessarily recommend that, and the kind of standardized techniques that we use for different people are based primarily on things like your experience level and whether or not the movement is classed as a novel stimulus or a non-productive stress that we're trying to convert into a productive one. So you can check that video out as well. But you'll see as we go through, I'm just warming up, and ultimately the talking is going to stop in a moment because I'm going to have to get in the mindset that I need when it comes to hitting some. My deadlift warm-up, one of the main things I'm focusing on is explosiveness and gaining a feel for the mechanics of the movement. I don't focus on it as much as I would in lighter sessions, particularly when it's heavy. I kind of just dive in with the mindset of moving some heavy weight, but I still prioritise within the warm-up phase contracting my lats, making sure that my glutes are firing at the bottom of the movement, making sure that I'm keeping my abs braced. As you can see, when I'm warming up, I'm trying to lift the weight as explosively as possible, but also make it as consistent as possible, even down from the setup, the foot that I step to the bar first with, everything like that. I want it to be as consistent as possible, just to try and remove any error. When it comes to the jumps that I make, it's not necessarily standardized. I go off how I feel. If I feel stronger on that particular day, or I feel like the movement is working really well, then I'm going to take bigger jumps, because I don't necessarily need that same amount of practice just to gain a feel for it. However, the opposite is true. If I'm not feeling 100%, I'll take 1 or 2 extra warm-up sets, a couple more reps in there, just to make sure that I'm getting that pattern down before I'm lifting anything heavy. Focusing purely on building up the intensity. When it's a bar with 60 kilos on, I don't necessarily attack that weight. It's as the weight starts to increase and we're getting upwards of 200 that I start to get a bit more tenacity, so to speak, and be a bit more explosive within the lift itself. So just going back to the point that we mentioned earlier with regards to taking a bit of initiative in the warm-ups, I don't always perform these types of exercises like banded pull-aparts and straight arm pull-downs and so on. This was purely just to get a bit of blood flow into my upper back, because when I was warming up with the lighter weights, I could feel that there was a little bit of a lack of stiffness there. So rather than going through a whole intricate setup of different postural correction exercises, which, although they are very important within the heavy sessions, it's not something that I'm wanting to focus on, because it's a completely different mindset shift. I'll just throw in an exercise like you see there, banded row, banded pull down or something like that, just to get a bit of blood flow into those areas, get a bit of a better mind muscle connection, so that when it comes to going into the lift, I'm consciously aware of what those muscles are doing as I'm performing the movement. So I'm just trying to integrate that new kind of proprioception into the deadlift itself. So the warm-ups are done, went from 50 to 90 to 150 to 190, 210, 230, and now we're set up for the 255 for 5. So let's crack on and see how we get on. That went pretty well. Not gonna lie, during the warm-ups and everything and over these past couple of days, to give you an idea of what my training's been, it's basically been 4 deadlift sessions a week, 1 just heavy single at the start of the week, and I'll explain that in a moment. Second session is a assistance exercise for my deadlift, so I do snatch grip Romanian deadlifts, just to work on keeping my upper back tight, and I'll explain that in a moment. My third session is volume, just focused purely on building up with lighter weight. And then my last session of the week, I basically increased the weights by 10 kilos every single week, and just maxed out as many reps as I could. I've had a goal in mind, so I did 200 for 10, 210 for 9, 220 for 8, 230 for 8, 244 for 6, and then now I've gone to 254 for 5. Now, so I wasn't really sure how this will pan out. It's always kind of uncharted territory. So going back to the way I've outlined my training, I do the heavy deadlift single at the start of the week. I don't write down a number, I use what's called RPE. So I just base the specific weight that I'm going to lift off an 8 out of 10, let's say. It should feel like an 8 out of 10 difficulty, which means I should be able to do at least 2 more reps at that weight. And then I just leave it there. The goal with that session as well is I do absolute minimal warm-ups. That's to familiarise my body with the notion of not having a significant amount of time to warm up, so that it's not as taxing on my body and it's not as novel of a stimulus, which is one of the factors of productive and non-productive stress. It's not a novel stimulus when it comes to this session where I'm trying to conserve energy. My second session, I'm working on my weaknesses that I know will be brought about through deadlifting in this way. So I do all of my other deadlifts, okay, other than my heavy work, I do all of my deadlifts with a neutral spine. So I pull my shoulders back intentionally, try and keep my chest as high as I can. It's only on this day where I employ the kind of thoracic flexion position. The deadlift volume day, I started off at 80 kilograms for sets of 8, and I built up to being able to do, I've done around, if you calculate the tonnage of the lift, so the sets times the reps times the load, I've done around 20,000 kilos worth of deadlifts this week, which is why I said I wasn't sure how it was going to be. So I've been able to build up a pretty decent tolerance to this movement. But anyway, enough nerd talk. I'm stoked at that, absolutely.
On to do my favourite assistance exercise for the deadlift, which is stiff-legged deadlifts. I actually perform them on a deficit, and I want to make sure that I'm developing strength throughout a larger range of motion, so only on a slight deficit. The key here is to focus on tightening up your posterior chain and minimising the involvement of your legs. Again, it all goes down to the individuality and technique. Some people will benefit more from stiff leg deadlifts, some people will benefit more from block deadlifts. Different variations suit different people.
Okay guys, so